Okay. All right, folks. Welcome to this meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. Before I turn it over to your chair, I'll just say once again, we're in Zoom here in a Zoom meeting where council members, members of the public, and all folks who are observing our meeting today are all together in this Zoom room. And we really appreciate the folks who are hanging in there with us and observing our meetings. Our sort of standard protocol, if this is the first time you're joining us, is we ask that counselors, if you can, to keep your cameras on. And those who are observing this meeting, if you can keep your cameras off and refrain from using the chat until the public comment period, which we'll do later in the day. With that, let me turn it over to your chair, Kristen Klauser. Go ahead, Kristen.
Thanks, David. So I'll just quickly run through the agenda today. We will start with review and approval of the December 1st minutes that David will take us through. Then we'll go into a just transitions reflection around public engagement. And at 2 o'clock, we'll have an overview of ARPA dollars from Doug Barnum, the AOA Chief of Operations. At 2:30, we will have ARPA investments in climate action discussion from Secretary Moore, Commissioner Tierney, and Jen Holler. Then at 2:45, we will have a discussion by Jane of process for allocating ARPA dollars. And then Jane will continue with next steps, focusing on timeline for appendices, process reflection, and council meetings moving forward in 2022. We'll finish with public comment around 4 o'clock, assuming we're on schedule. Any changes or additions to the agenda? Great. Well, hearing none, I'll hand it back to David. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. Excellent. Okay. All right. So the bulk of our work today is looking at the ARPA dollars and what we as a council want, what you as a council want to do about that. Our minutes, as always, are hyperlinked into the agenda. I'll give you a moment to click through that if you need to. Members of the public, you can always find information on our meeting. In fact, if Marion, if you, in addition, you want to throw in the chat the overall meeting page from the website that'll have all the documents we'll use today, including the agenda. I'm just giving folks a minute to click through if there's anything on the minutes they want to bring up. Leslie Ann, please go ahead.
Thanks, David. Just a couple corrections on the first page under the 1040 piece. The first bullet point that says the CAP should do a better job in the future of highlighting hazards beyond flooding. And then the next piece, if we could change that to climate change, human impacts, such as mental health, air quality, heat waves, to kind of flesh it all out.
Great. To do a better job of reflecting that conversation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we've got all of the pieces in terms of human health.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie Ann, for catching that. Other revisions or concerns about the agenda? Okay. Any concerns about adopting it with the changes that Leslie Ann says to better reflect that first little bit? Okay, great. Thanks. Let's consider those approved with those changes as outlined by Leslie Ann. Wonderful. Okay. All right. So as we always want to do, we want to have the first thing we do in our meetings to be a reflection related to our just transitions and equity work. Today, we thought it would be helpful for the council just to spend a few moments reflecting on what comes next with public and stakeholder engagement. And this is something we've talked about a couple times, right? And we have consultants on board that can do some work around this plan that we just adopted last week. We have specific text in the plan about how we want to think about public process going forward, both in the introductory letter and in the implementation sections, specific language that the Just Transition Subcommittee helped to draft. And I was thinking one of us, Jane or myself, we could share that language again, just so we look at it. And if we just spend 10, 15 minutes and think about putting some ideas on the table around public engagement going forward, that would be time well spent for us. And it's been such one of the big frustrations in this last few months that we haven't been reaching out in the way that we might want to, that reiterating that now and thinking proactively about what the next few months should look like would be a great exercise. Let me pause for 1 second and ask Jane or anybody else who is thinking about this reflection moment if you'd want to refine or supplement what I said for what we're trying to do here.
Well, I'll add briefly that there has been a lot of criticism of what we weren't able to do through our public engagement process. And just really, as we're starting to plan for what we hope will be a robust, composure of explaining the plan, as well as engaging with Vermonters in the start of the new year and then ongoing, we're really hoping to actually have some structural suggestions from all of you about tangible ways that we can improve it and build that into our process. So really, rather than sort of look back and hearken on what we haven't been able to do, really think about tangible next steps we can take to have a more authentic public engagement process as we roll out the CAP.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, now I'll just remind folks in what the Just Transitions subcommittee worked on in the language. This is in the implementation section of the CAP. And this is what was coming out of the Just Transitions subcommittee around the next steps on public engagement, where calling out specifically the importance of adequate funding and staffing to do inclusive and innovative engagement strategies. Specific call out about the way this is transmitted in plain and accessible ways, and a call out to language. A third bullet here is about, again, the ways in which we engage and the different types of media we might use in that engagement. And again, a nod to sort of reaching people where they're at and what and how they can best engage into a conversation. Thinking about this as an ongoing dialogue that over time, rather than I'm coming out to talk to you about this plan, it's about how we setting up a process that builds relationship over time and engagement that's meaningful over time. With this word that's been elusive for us in the co-creation piece, but really that's where we're headed to. Okay, and then this is a bullet talking about sort of the full timeline of this process through, so we're not just talking about right now, but how we are imagining opportunities in the future during implementation, et cetera. And this one is what the Just Transitions group talked a lot about in terms of how are we partnering with trusted community organizations to reach in a meaningful way impacted communities, and how that works. All right, so those are some of the ideas that's already in the plan coming out of the Just Transitions group and that you looked at earlier. And I wanted to just pause for a little bit. And if there's something that folks want to reflect on right now to build on those points or make other ones, let's do that for 10 minutes or so and just get some ideas going amongst the council. And then this will be ongoing work of Just Transition Subcommittee as well, together with you all. So Sue, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you all so much. Well, I would just make the point that today we're talking about ARPA funding. So to the degree we keep going and we go forward in a manner that is more at the so-called speed of trust and more in concert with the folks who at least our subcommittee are trying to reach and who haven't been able to be a part of this for all kinds of reasons that we've discussed, but to actually resource the trusted community organizations that are known and understood by those communities. And I'm going to put out a very strange allegory or example, but when I was Secretary of Transportation and we were about to unearth major downtown communities like Barry, Waterbury, and Middlebury by doing these major infrastructure investments that nobody was happy about and nobody knew was coming, we actually resourced the downtown organizations to do community organizing, outreach, and mobilization. I think it's community organizing, and in and of the communities that we're trying to reach and investing in the very organizations that are set up to do that, that we should consider utilizing these ARPA dollars for as a first tack. Thanks. And by the way, Secretary Flynn will know that those communities that were battling against us and terrified and angry came to, understand and appreciate these very challenging disruptions to their lives and embrace these new investments in their communities. And we're at the other side of that for the most part. But it is that model of making sure the people who know the folks we're talking about, and it ain't us, obviously, are the ones with the resources to reach out. Thanks.
I'm on mute. Sorry, I was saying Jane.
I was just going to add briefly before Stu so eloquently added a great idea and suggestion that this is really well timed because the Just Transition Subcommittee is meeting next week, is going to be joined by Climate Access and RISE to consider the plan that was narrowly defined for the work that will happen with their support after the holiday season, starting in January, that we shared with you all as a council a number of meetings ago now, and to work in concert with Just Transitions to consider what the role of the subcommittee will be in supporting that plan as well as building upon that plan. So we will certainly learn from all of you today and take with us the ideas that are brought up today into the conversation with our contractors as well as with Just Transition.
Thanks, Jane. That's great. Chris, go ahead, please.
Yeah, one of the things I think we might benefit from getting out sooner rather than later is it's not only what this plan will do, but what it won't do. And I'm thinking specifically within the context of no one is coming for your internal combustion car or truck. Nobody's coming to take the boiler out of your house. Nobody's coming to take away your hot water heater. Because there is rhetoric, about basically fear that that somehow through this plan, somebody is coming for something that you've already got. Whereas the goal is actually to help people transition as things kind of age out and they need to replace them. So I would just suggest that we try to get ahead of that. The other thing too is, I think back to my younger self before I don't know if there's so many people who kind of, I think, associate energy with their kind of way of life. You know, and how 16-year-old me would respond to, you know, thinking about, well, how will I live without my 72 Dodge Challenger? And what happened with me was, you know, it was hunting and fishing and conservation, and then you know, sustainable agriculture, landscape architecture, planning, all this kind of good trajectory. But we might want to reach out to groups that aren't the ones we typically reach out to. I mean, reaching out to energy committees and, you know, advocacy groups and all is great, but I'm thinking also, you know, other, you know, outdoors organizations, just other organizations that have a lot at stake in this, but may not necessarily see themselves as an advocate for the current plan or the planning going forward. So just don't want to forget those types of groups. Just to help reach more Vermonters where they are.
Thanks, Chris. And I think picking your brain in the future about who you think those groups might be would be helpful, right? So if you want to think a little more about that and shoot an email, that'd be great. Jared.
Thanks, David. One of the things that I'm thinking about is really appreciating some of the language that's in the climate action plan that really recognizes that it's not just the kind of what of public engagement, but the how. And I think one of the things that we had expressed a desire to do over the last year, but it didn't happen to the degree I think many of us were hoping for, that I want to kind of put back on the table and hear from Jane or others who may have had conversations. I know this had come up with Climate Access and RISE before. I know it's a recommendation that Richard Cowart has made. And that is, you know, we've gotten a lot of public comments in the traditional way. I think the last time I looked, 446 submitted via the website, you know, some people showing up to some public meetings and on webinars and speaking at the end of council meetings or subcommittee meetings. But I really think in terms of that kind of, you know, ongoing back and forth kind of co-creation and learning together, one of the things I'm really hoping we can do more of is in the realm of deliberative polling, because I think that, you know, there's an opportunity to not just hear feedback, but also increase awareness in both directions. Our awareness as counselors of the concerns, the hopes, the questions that that Vermonters have for this process, but also for folks who haven't been as deeply engaged in this process as we have, be able to put on the table and present some of the areas where we're trying to balance, areas where there may be trade-offs that need to be thought through. And so the extent to which we can not just have it be kind of a one-off public comment, but a more kind of immersive, deliberative polling type of experience that we develop, you know, for some parts of the next year, I think that would really be really beneficial in both directions, including getting beyond just the kind of generation of, you know, wish lists or the top of mind stuff to how does this actually get implemented? What are the trade-offs? What are the key considerations? What are the pros and cons? So we can go that next level down in kind of engagement and substance.
Thanks, Jared. And for folks who might not be as familiar with the term deliberative polling, I believe, Jared, you're referring to those practices where you use a sample of citizens or residents or whoever, and oftentimes done with a professional polling firm to get a randomized sample. And then you invite them to come to an actual event or have an experience of deliberation around the issues. You poll them before and you poll them after this deliberative event. And that's typically called deliberative polling. Yeah, great. Super, thanks, Jared. Catherine, go ahead.
Thanks, David. I wanted to support Sue's note about the utilizing groups that have this expertise and are trusted within the communities within which they work. I would also like to add that I hope when that is done, that it can be done in a way that it's understood that this is part of the Climate Council's work, and that it's not that these groups are doing the work because the Climate Council is failing to. And so I just think that's important that that's clear in those efforts so that the Climate Council's role in supporting that is understood by people. I was curious because I don't remember it being in the proposal whether we're going to continue the idea of affinity spaces and if that is something that seems as important to those who might participate in affinity spaces. I hope that we do continue that. And then finally, although it's somewhat public engagement, but somewhat not, I keep open on my browser that letter we got in the spring from the Vermont Renews by Council. And I actually go back and look at it periodically to see how we're doing. And I think we've really not done well in terms of responding to the points that were made in that letter. And for me, when I think about something tangible that we can do now that we have some space and time, is I really think we ought to collectively look at our subcommittee membership and have some assistance from people to identify key leaders that we can bring on to our subcommittees as we continue our work, to make sure that the voices that we want to hear are actually empowered with votes through some of our work and not just have their feedback sought later or as an aside thing that we're doing. So those would be my 3 points, and thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah. Rich and then Jane. Or Abby.
I wanted to just speak to the really 2 points. First is I really agree with Chris Campany on making sure that our outreach includes a broad swath of Vermonters, including folks who aren't necessarily inclined at first get-go to be very engaged on climate and environmental policies. And to echo Sue's point about working with downtown associations, but recognizing that we need to find equivalent organizations in rural places as well. And then my third point is to talk about deliberative polling, which I have seen work extremely well when people are given the opportunity to engage collaboratively as opposed to just react to an idea. Surprising things happen, and creative learning occurs, and collaborative engagement actually yields sometimes really surprising results.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah. Jane and then Abby.
Yeah, thank you. I raised my hand to respond about the deliberative polling, but might just take a few points, hopefully to inform further comments from all of you. But first off, and David was clarifying his understanding of deliberative polling. I do just want to say that the way that it's teed up in the contract with Climate Access and RISE, if we choose to use it, they have a vendor that they've worked with in the past. I envision it sort of like a marriage of a story map and deliberative polling. If folks are familiar with that tool, as they've pitched it to us, as it can be sort of a bifurcated communication effort where we're educating the public about components of the climate action plan that are moving through a process now, such as the legislature, to hopefully realize their implementation. And then also communicate with the public the components of the CAP where we have further work to do and refinement, and hopefully in the effort to engage Vermonters in shaping how we move forward with the work that is still needed by the Climate Council and its subcommittees. We have a meeting with Climate Access this week, and one of the focuses of that meeting in particular is to have a run through again of the tool where they've used it with other communities in order to bring Marion and I up to speed on its capacity and how beneficial it would be for this process going forward, at which point we would surely bring it to the council to think about next steps with how we would use it. Just a few other quick comments. I do just want to say that I too look at the Renew letter quite a bit, and one of the key takeaways beyond the subcommittees for me was the council membership itself. And that power hierarchy that we have. And I will say that in both opportunities, when Sophia Clark and when Adam Newsom left the council, we sent that letter and shared it with the legislature, who controls the majority of seats and reminded them of our interest in having greater diversity on the council in their appointments. So I encourage you all to work with the legislature to let them know of your interest in that too, as seats and opportunities come up for replacement of council members. As far as affinity spaces, I just want to say that we're only planning right now through Climate Access and RISE to have 3 online events, none of which will be affinity spaces. And there's a number of reasons for that, but Climate Access and RISE have suggested just to have 3 online events. But my last point I was going to make around community engagement is we do have money and weren't able to really fully realize this in the fall because of timing to support community groups like we were all discussing and the benefits of that, but also making sure that it's a council supported event so folks know that. Those could possibly be affinity spaces, especially recognizing the partners that we choose to work with and the networks that they activate and how we support that. So I don't think just if our 3 online events aren't affinity spaces, we can surely find ways to support those to bring those Vermonters to the table.
Thanks, Jane. All very helpful clarifications. Abby, please go ahead.
So I echo Catherine's idea, but also Lauren's concerns about the time commitment. And I feel the other thing I just need to say, as somebody who certainly carries a literally minority representation or voice here, in the sense that there are not very many people in agriculture anymore, that the level of explanation and fighting and hierarchical issues of attempting to bring forward your perspective is so difficult and so time consuming. And I still do not feel at the point that we're at in this process, like I have even reached a place of feeling like I have made the points that I really feel I need to make from the perspective that I come from for us to have a better shared future together. And so I do need to say that we need to be cognizant of the fact that we have not earned trust in a lot of places. And in fact, the entirety of this process has really, I think, kneecapped our ability to do that because of the way the law was created and then the way that the process was handled. And so I guess what I would like to say is, if we're going to continue to go down this road, which I do think is important, we need to have a lot of humility about how we go into these communities and how we are thinking that they might even be willing to show up at this point, because so many of them do feel that they have been handed a mandate without being asked and trusted to come to the table. And those of us that were asked and have been at the table have still quite a lot of feelings about how all of this went. And I just think we really need to be thinking about that. Yes, we can fund this. Yes, we can try to capacitate this, but we need to have a lot of humility. And we also need to be willing to listen to what we hear and take a leap of faith on communities' perspective that know how to do the things that we're asking be done for a better, more viable future here. And I have not personally witnessed a lot of that in this process. And I think that really needs to change, because none of this is going to happen without the people who have to make weatherize the houses, like do all of these things. The people who have to do this work need to be bought into this work, and we need to approach them where they are and listen to their concerns and their fears and what they need to do that.
Yeah. Thanks, Abby. Yeah. Are there other reflections? Leslie Ann?
Yeah, Thanks, David. I just wanted to follow up on all of the points that were just raised. And I think there's one additional piece that we need to sort of sit with. And it's the cultural reality of who and what Vermont is at this particular point in time. And I think it's a sort of a watershed moment where we need to really sort of stop and think about if we are serious about co-creation, we may not be doing it in the same way that we have or planning to do, because it won't get us to where we think we would like to be. And so I think part of the lessons learned is reflecting on, like I said last week, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I think a lot of it is taking the time and taking the space to actually sort of listen to. It's probably going to be really, really hard to hear some of this stuff, but I think we need to actually allow folks to say, I don't feel included, or I don't feel part of this conversation. I don't understand, and see what the lack of understanding is, so that we can actually step forward in the way that we would like to step forward, so that we are serving all Vermonters. And so to the extent that the public engagement becomes public listening rather than public telling or public sharing, but really, really going to where people are, whether it's in basements or whether it's in parking lots or whether it's wherever, but actually creating that space to hear, I think would really allow us to get a pulse on what some of those next steps are, and really being sensitive to our culture, our cultural component, our fabric is going to help us to honor all of the voices that may come to the table.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. Yeah. June?
So I've been listening to this conversation, and it's a place where I've lived my entire career. How to reach the people I represent. As the daughter of a psychoanalyst, when I hear somebody say, I feel a certain way, my immediate reflex is, can you tell me more about why you feel that way? And what I think we need to do is make sure that the different methods we've been talking about are conducive to that kind of exploratory conversation, because people don't feel heard until they've been asked to unpack their thoughts and feelings, and in turn have had them reflected back to them. I think we've had some excellent suggestions here about methods, trusted methods in our circles that can be used to gather data, such as deliberative polling. And I think we've also heard very clearly that we have to have a real face in these communities. What keeps coming back to me are the comments that John Copans gave us in our next to last reflection, I think, before we adopted the plan, where he was telling us how, what he's hearing in firehouses and the like in the state. And I think getting down to that level is equally critical. What I would suggest is, before we completely demoralize ourselves because we all feel we need to do better, but perhaps we're not settled yet on how, that we try to have a systematic approach to inventorying the thoughts that have been put forward today. Perhaps having a collective of folks who work on this outreach strategy, and that we begin by saying, you know what, we don't know how to do this. We are making this up, and that is okay, because we're also trying to do something we've never done before, which is not just have a plan, but have a plan that is realistic for implementation and that speaks to people and that has buy-in. So I'm partly preaching here to raise morale. We can do this. We can do something different. We can do something loving. We can do something true. And we also can have both the rigor of systematic approaches and due attention to feelings, which begin with acknowledging the need for the humility that Abby's talking about. I hope this has been helpful to you, and perhaps we could give some thought. Maybe we don't need the rigor of another committee. I'm loath to suggest that, but I will go so far as to say that if we don't get this part of our work right, there's a serious question about what the point is of doing the rest of the work. Those are my 2 cents.
June. I think that's a really good sentiment to end on. And Kaya, you've been involved in this from as a co-chair of the subcommittee, Just Transition Subcommittee, and then as a key consultant helping subcommittees and the council walk through it. Do you have a reflection on this?
I do. I think it's something that's going to be very important. I've started having some conversations with different legislators who are like, what do we do? How do we help? How do we help at this point? And this is something that we've talked about in a few different spaces, I think, and throughout the course of this is, so while you're doing this community outreach and engagement, who is analyzing all of that? Who is really we need to go that deep, but we also need to have a mechanism for actually ensuring that we're hearing and we're analyzing what's coming from those conversations, from those surveys, from whatever we're utilizing as tools for getting that input. So as we're thinking about your budgeting around what that community engagement looks like, how will that happen? Because it is going to take multiple community partners. It could take, a variety of looking at our academic institutions and groups that can help to drive that, because someone will need to manage and have a container for that in order for it to actually have meaning coming back to the group. So I would just remind folks of that it's wonderful to collect data. Somebody has to analyze it at the end of the day. And without that, they're just data points and numbers and words. So that was my kind of comment at this point.
Thanks, Kaya. That's really, really helpful. Okay. So that was a great conversation that grounds us in the work ahead. And there's some specific to-dos out of that in addition to the reflection, right? Some to-dos about how are we being systematic about these thoughts? How are we doing the lessons learned piece, which I think Leslie Ann asked us to do last time. And we've talked with Jane about getting that on the agenda to really do a systematic lessons learned out of this. Okay. Great. Okay, so if folks are okay, let's go ahead and transition into the conversation around the funding piece, the ARPA dollars. And let's carry this forward into that conversation because this will be relevant too, as we're thinking about the kinds of things that might be funded or warrant funding or how to fund them. All right. There has been a lot in the chat as well, which I'm not going to review, but there's been a fair amount of back and forth in the chat on various ideas. I encourage you to look at that if you haven't looked at it yet. Okay. All right. So we have a multi-step process to work our way into this conversation around ARPA dollars. The first step on that process is to get our hands around the sort of overall conditions and criteria that have to be used because they're the conditions and criteria that the Treasury is doing, and sort of an overall big picture on that. And we've asked Doug Farnham, who's Chief of Operations at, I'll get the agency wrong. Help me out, Jane.
The Agency of Administration.
Oh, it didn't. Okay, sorry. Thanks, Kristen Shop. Okay, to give us this sort of overview. And then the next step we'll do after Doug's presentation is we'll have some quick hits about other related investments that are happening in addition to the quote unquote climate specific ones. But these related ones are part of your climate action plan anyway. So we'll hear from Julie about water, June about broadband, and Jen Holler about housing, affordable housing, all of which are part of the climate action plan, right? And then we're going to get into actually thinking about how you all will make some decisions about the kind of recommendations you want to make. So that's our multi-step process. We start with Doug, and I'm just looking on my screen to make sure Doug is here. Yeah?
Yes, I saw him.
Okay.
Yes, I'm
I
here.
saw him somewhere.
There you are.
Thank
Okay.
you, Doug, for being here.
So thanks, Doug, and I'll turn it over to you. And if you need someone to share slides for you or anything, just shout out. But thanks for being here and giving us this overview of really the context of how we have to think about ARPA dollars and the types of constraints that are on them.
Great. Thank you for having me, David. It's nice to see everybody. A lot of faces I know, but a lot of faces I also don't know. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I don't have any slides today. I was going to do an intro conversation and hopefully leave some room for questions about the general lay of the land. So the ARPA, the ARPA Act created the state and local coronavirus relief, the recovery fund. So that fund to Vermont, that appropriation was $1.049 billion from the feds to the state. So that's what we have been allocated at this point in the federal math. What we have received from them is just over 500 million. The mechanics of it are that in the first year, we draw down half of that. So we draw down 524.6 million. And then the second year, we recertify and draw down the second half of that money. From an appropriations and planning perspective, there's nothing in there to indicate that Treasury can choose not to give us the second half. So the Vermont legislature and the governor are both planning with the full 1.049 billion in mind. So that's the starting point. Last year's legislative session, about a little over 600 million was appropriated, and then some things were swapped for general fund, bringing us down to 506 million currently appropriated to specific uses. So that means that just under half of the federal dollars at this point have been appropriated to existing uses. And about 50 million of that was in the category of climate change, primarily in weatherization and other programs that have an impact on emissions. As part of a policy statement in Act 74, the legislature made a policy statement that as a mix of state and federal funds, they divided up 1.225 billion into a bunch of different buckets. And climate change was a $250 million bucket in that multi-funding policy statement. So that 50 million that I just talked about, that was ARPA state fiscal recovery, came out of that 250, leaving 200 million of policy intent at the legislature's level, still on the table for climate change uses specifically. When looking at state fiscal recovery, again, so those are the high level numbers, and apologies if I ran through them a bit quickly. I can revisit any of the numbers if you'd like, but with somewhere in the range of 500 million on the table and 200 million of mixed funding sources, potentially not quite earmarked, but with the intent at the legislative side of dedicating those to climate change. Obviously, state fiscal recovery is one of the funding sources to consider. The most obvious uses of the state fiscal recovery fund are the ones that I think David may have referenced before, which is the water, sewer, broadband. That's the clearly earmarked place in state fiscal recovery, where if it's a water, sewer, broadband project and it meets the pre-existing definitions for water and sewer, which primarily flowed through the EPA and the state revolving fund, those are going to be presumptively eligible. Broadband has some act-specific requirements at the federal level that define what is a broadband project and what makes it eligible as a broadband project. And then there's a couple of other areas of the bill where climate change could fit in. The first is economic impact. Now, economic impact can be assessed at the individual level. And that's how Treasury most commonly assesses it, is to individual households. So once you've determined a household has been economically impacted by COVID, you can give them just about any type of assistance you'd like, as long as it's roughly proportional to the harm that they suffered. You can't, find that they were barely impacted and buy them a new house, for example. But you can find that they were impacted and then help them weatherize their home. That's the primary mechanism we're using to justify state fiscal recovery for our weatherization programs, is that those households were presumed to be, if they're lower income, they can be presumed to be impacted by COVID. And then we can provide them with the benefit of weatherizing their homes in order to provide them a financial benefit going forward and a more stable home environment, et cetera. So that economic impact lens, I think, is very important for when you're talking about creating potential programs related to climate change. Now, reading through the interim final rule and the authorizing law for the state fiscal recovery, there are very few references to climate change. Treasury does have climate change as a reference in one of their compliance and reporting guides, but the act itself doesn't really contemplate it. So for the most part, you can't get directly there. I think there are some comments in, and things may change going forward when Treasury publishes the final rule. I think the Biden administration is obviously quite friendly to climate change and may expand that category. But at the time being, there's no direct path to justifying a project or justifying use of funds with the fact that it's climate change or climate resilient. So I think the economic impact is the primary channel. The other ways of justifying projects get into making communities or households more resilient to future outbreaks. So some climate change projects could have that effect, right? They could create spaces which are friendlier and more resilient going forward. Thinking of, for example, community centers that would provide, modernizing community centers is one thought that comes to mind, where if you're talking about an old inefficient building that has a oil furnace in the basement, if you're updating that, if you're reducing its emissions and you're making it a safer and more productive space for that community, generally you'd have to tie that to the community having that need, being economically disadvantaged. But that's one path to getting a project which has the goal of climate change through the ARPA eligibility categories. So sorry if I'm running a bit quick here. I'd just like to pause and see if there's anybody has any questions on anything I've said so far.
Any questions, folks? Leslie, please.
Thanks for running through some of those examples, Doug. I'm just wondering, how broadly can you think in this space? Like, is it okay to think broadly? So you use the example of community centers. And when you started talking about that, I immediately thought about community centers that might serve cooling purposes, again, in heat waves. Can you think that broadly? Is it okay to think of resilience as broadly as possible?
So I think in approaching the coronavirus relief fund last year, and in the initial session of going after of analyzing the state fiscal recovery, I think the state has proven willing to take on varying levels of risk depending on how important and how critical the policy outcome is. So I think that cases can be made, and for some programs we've had to build in additional justification, additional documentation to support a policy outcome that we really think is valuable. So I think we need to find a link. But the thing is, with that particular case you mentioned, a lot of that would hang on the community that you're talking about putting that in. If you can justify a need that is a disadvantaged community that needs some form of benefit, then we have a lot of flexibility in what that benefit is that we're actually providing. As long as we're doing something for a disadvantaged community, there is some flexibility built into the rule to give the state of Vermont discretion in how it applies that. And I would say primarily, that would go through the legislative process, and then the administration would have the parameters set by the legislature to work within. And then we'd only modify the program as much as we needed to fit it into the federal rules, if that makes sense.
Yep. Thanks for that clarification.
Sue, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about eligibility determination. It sounds as if you have guidance that suggests that all low, moderate, or income or disadvantaged communities as a category are eligible to receive these funds, or is this something we would have to establish in legislation or by rule or something? And are there other kind of categories of eligibility that either exist or that we are thinking about? Or are we going to have to make a case by case determination on categories? Is it all COVID impact that we need to determine? Thanks.
Right. That's a great question, Sue. So the rule sets up qualified census tracts as the only area in the rule that is presumptively eligible. So, but that doesn't buy us much in Vermont. Those qualified census tracts do not cover a great portion of our population or land area. But what they do leave the door open for at Treasury, and what the state has chosen to do for several programs, is to find income-based metrics that will identify a community as disadvantaged. One way of doing this is we use the, or we're contemplating the use, I think this program is still launching, of high poverty school districts, because that's a measure that the Agency of Education tracks, and they have it at a couple different levels. But we picked, I believe, the 50% high poverty level. And we said, if an applicant comes from this area and attests that they have a need, we're going to identify them as eligible for this program. So that's one way we were able to geographically qualify areas and reduce the need for specific income documentation or, going down the well. If the other fairly safe ways we've done it, basing it on other federal programs, is anyone below 80% of area median income is qualified for other federal programs that were created during the pandemic. So those are automatically very safe standards to use. And 50% is still a relatively safe threshold to use, 50% of area median income. And because that was used in the homeowners assistance fund federal program. So wherever we can, we try to set up these geographical or standards, but we can also go back to the income of the individuals. If it's some kind of incentive program to influence behavior in a more climate friendly manner, then those income standards could be very useful.
Sue, do you have a follow-up on that, or does that makes sense?
I have so many follow-ups that I'm going to leave it there, but that was very,
Okay.
very helpful. Thank you at the outset.
Great. I see a bunch of hands. Chris, go ahead, please.
So you may not be the one to answer this, but I'll throw it out there. I'm trying to get a handle on, so, municipalities have received significant amounts of funding. The funding went directly to the municipalities. The regional commissions and Vermont League of Cities and Towns are collaborating to work with the towns to help them figure out how to make the most of the funding that they've got. The message has generally been, be deliberate, take your time, think big, because we don't even have all the full guidance yet. But what I'm trying to figure out is the extent to which the state strategies, and we'll be talking about those here in a minute, have they come about within the context of how do we really kind of maximize the benefits to the municipalities and the state by structuring the state programs in a way that municipalities can really access them and they'll really make a difference, versus, and I would understand the second one too, versus kind of like more how do we tweak our existing programs to where they're accessible, but they're still pretty easy to administer at the state agency level, which I would totally get, because I know state agencies have lost a lot of senior people and administrative capacity is not necessarily increased. But I'm just wondering how much strategic thinking has gone into this by actually engaging with municipalities, RPCs, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, to really think strategically about how to maximize these investments. And if that hasn't really happened, is there time to do that?
Yeah, so I would say firsthand, I have a weekly meeting with VLCT and their ARPA team, And we coordinated a survey of the regional planning commissions through the VLCT to get a handle on what local projects, what municipal projects were out there, and specifically in the areas where we might have ARPA state fiscal recovery overlap. So I think we can always improve our coordination, but it's definitely high on our radar that we need to coordinate. And, we're working on a way to do, visual overlays that show where the state projects are and where the municipal projects are, so we don't step on each other's toes and so that we can make projects more effective. I'd say, a lot of those discussions are still really early. And in some cases, Agency of Natural Resource, Agency of Transportation, they're all very experienced at working with the towns. So we're sharing all of this information with all of our agencies that have those direct connections to the towns as well. And it's something we have to keep our eyes on and keep working at. I wouldn't say we're there yet, but we're definitely trying to build that relationship.
Thanks, Doug.
Joey, please go ahead.
Thanks, Doug. This is super helpful. And Chris asked some of what I wanted to explore was the municipal question. But then I have another question for you related to sort of the assessing economic impact. So since the program began and money started coming in, COVID is arguably intensifying, but really more so over the last year. Sort of the price of fossil fuels and the volatility of this market has really seen dramatic price increases. And my question is, really, is there a different analysis or possibility for a different analysis to weigh the economic impact to enable more things like heat pump hot water heaters or things that would reduce, or put downward pressure on the cost of fossil fuels?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely something where we don't need to get our feet locked into stone on it. We have a couple standards that we created early on that were very safe and they were grounded in federal programs. But the Treasury did leave the door open for the state to use discretion to identify. I think the important thing there is that if someone's low income or a community, if you look at, for instance, the difficult to develop area designation compares average incomes to rental rates. And that's one way of looking at a lower income community, right? Is that if their rent to income ratios are poor, then the entire region is likely to have a high amount of disadvantaged people. If you're talking about a heat pump program, that can be the benefit and being in that region could be automatic qualification. And then it's also important to note that our programs sometimes have 2 or 3 ways to get to yes. So we don't have to design a program with just one way to qualify. We can try to create multiple paths so that really we want to get, if we create a program for $3 million for heat pump incentives, we want to get it to the right people. And my team's job has really been to try to figure out the cleanest way to get there under the Treasury rules. So after the legislation is passed, that's when we do a little bit more design and make sure that we can get to the legislative intent of the program.
Let's take these next 2 questions and then we may transition to hearing about what's going on with water and broadband and housing. But Jared and then Liz.
Thanks. First, Doug, just want to add my thanks for you taking the time. This has been a really helpful overview. I've become aware of some of the criteria that you're referencing by virtue of working on the Clean Energy Development Fund board. And I know we've designed a number of programs in coordination with the board and the Public Service Department in the last year that are looking at kind of the economic impact lens in terms of incentives for kind of individual households, because that has seemed the clearest and kind of cleanest way to make sure that we're aligned with the criteria for a number of these things, including, wood stove change outs and other things that are really helpful from a number of lenses in terms of both economic savings and health benefits of reduced particulate emissions. But one of the things that I'm wondering about is there was a lot of research that was being done throughout the pandemic. I just posted a link in the chat about public health research examining the link between areas of the country, I don't know if this was ever refined to the level of looking at this in Vermont, where there was increased particulate emissions, especially places with high vehicle traffic. Of course, gasoline and diesel are significant sources of particulate emissions, as are older wood stoves and power plants. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is, it seems pretty clear that we can provide incentives under these rules for folks, below 80% of area median income. But what if there's somebody 85 or 90% of area median income who could get an incentive for, an electric vehicle that would help reduce particulate emissions in that community and improve air quality? The reason I'm thinking about that is under the category you mentioned around households being more resilient to future outbreaks. My assumption would be the extent to which we can drive a lot of incentive programs that lead to electrification, thereby reducing particulate emissions and improving air quality, is going to help make us more resilient to future outbreaks. If areas with higher particulates, we're seeing, greater rates of hospitalization and worse outcomes from being infected. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of comment on how broadly that households more resilient to future outbreaks. And maybe it's unfair to put you on the spot, but I would imagine that even if a primary lens we're thinking about is emissions reduction, so often greenhouse gas emissions occur at the same time as particulate emissions, which have a more direct, localized effect on public health that I think probably is really relevant in this whole conversation.
Yeah, Jared, that's a great question. It was, I did dig into this a little bit at the, during last year's legislative, it was this year's legislative session. But it didn't prove necessary to employ that as a justification method. So I stopped the research kind of halfway. I would say that it is possible to get there. It's a little bit higher risk for the state. And like I said, the state, the legislatures made many decisions where, as long as they have all the information and they make a decision about what the relative level of risk with Treasury recapture. This isn't a clear case in the federal rules. We'd be interpreting them pretty aggressively, but I think it's worth having a conversation, and it would be worth going through. I think, like, for instance, on the electric vehicles, the easier justification for electrical vehicle charging stations would have been that they would help promote the travel and tourism industry by providing necessary infrastructure for people with electric vehicles to visit Vermont more easily. So that's an easy way to justify it under the Treasury rules. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the only policy reason Vermont's doing that, right?
Liz, go ahead.
Okay, a little bit of a riff on Jared and Joey and some of the other comments, but we've talked about heat pumps and EVs and wood stove changeouts and things like that. I'm wondering if under the economic impact criteria on the individual level that you talked about, or even looking at a community properly geographically qualified, we could also be looking at direct Vermonter in their homes and businesses infrastructure upgrades that would hit so much. It would hit potential carbon savings, getting toward the particulate and health issue that Jared just mentioned. It would actually affect their pocketbooks, because in the longer run, they would have fuel savings as well as, more modern, less costly operations for their homes and businesses. And it would enable broadband, because obviously, to the extent you have higher, better upgrades for electricity, and therefore you have the opportunity to bring that along at the same time, that sort of last mile problem we've worked on. It also, for telecommuting, would increase resiliency and reliability. In the future, storage devices, electric vehicle chargers, all the other things that would be necessary. So it'd be really interesting to see that direct Vermonter infrastructure. We've talked a lot about infrastructure on our roads and our poles and wires and other things that we can also do, but interested in your thoughts on direct Vermonter support in their homes for those types of upgrades that aren't specific to devices.
So I would say actually that general infrastructure projects are, not allowed with the exception of the water, sewer, broadband. So actually home-based, individual-based projects would be more allowable than Like if we were talking about a project to go work on poles, that would have a hard time. But if we're talking about infrastructure within their building, as long as we can find a way to say that this is a household that was impacted by COVID and deserves the assistance, that assistance can certainly take the nature of helping to upgrade their electrical wiring or something along those lines, or providing them with a battery to protect them during blackouts, et cetera.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
So I see additional hands going up. I think, Abby, I'd love to grab your comment. I don't know, Rich, if you want to throw yours in the chat and see if we can deal with it separately. But Abby, go ahead. I just want to make sure we have time to hear the other pieces of this puzzle.
Yeah, I'll try to go quick. Doug, I just wondered if one of the things I think we've sort of struggled to incorporate, and I continue to see it sort of missing from the kind of headline issues, is that of food. You know, we talk about water and infrastructure and heat, et cetera, but particularly in the nexus between COVID impacts and climate change, food insecurity became an enormous component of that. And the supply chain disruptions were also really impactful, both to communities, disadvantaged communities particularly. And I'm thinking what you said about community centers, I'm thinking about the fact that I now live in a food desert, and how many communities, rural communities, particularly in Vermont, are food deserts. And could that be a way that a qualifier, if you will, the level of food insecurity or the infrastructure available to people, local communities being able to access fresh food? Because for whatever reason, we tend to not talk about food as a really important component to all of this. But last I checked, we all need to eat. And I think we need to start thinking, you know, working that into our discussions as well. Food and water are almost equally important. And I just wondered if that was something that could be tied into the qualifications as well.
So food supply chain issues, there were some programs that were funded with CRF that would deal with that. And most things that are funded with CRF could potentially be funded with state fiscal recovery as well. It really would be a question of degree, because there could be a whole lot of different types of projects that would fall under that supply chain, food supply chain. And it's probably something that would need to be looked at more in the nature of, okay, what are we trying to do here? But at the basic level, we have done things related to food supply chain with federal funds, with pandemic federal funds. So it would likely, at a 30,000 foot level, it is one of the eligible uses that we've done in the past.
Okay. All right. That is incredibly instructive. I think the other piece of this puzzle that we wanted to make sure folks hear, and Doug, thank you so much. You are welcome to stay as long as you can and or want to. And what we're going to do, Jane's hand just went up so she can help me tee up the next piece of this, but we really wanted to speak to other areas that are directly connected to our climate action plan, that have additional and separate streams from this 200 million that Doug mentioned is earmarked for climate action. Jane, did you want to frame this up differently?
No, but before we excuse Doug, as I'm sure he is really busy, I did just want to give him 2 minutes if there was anything else that he wanted to close out with, because I did recognize that Doug had paused for questions as he was talking through the numbers, and then the questions sort of ran away with him. So if there was anything else sort of at this high level that you were hoping to orient us to before we dove into the more specifics of their application, the ARPA dollars, just wanted to give you the floor again if there was anything else.
Oh, thank you, Jane. No, actually, in the chat, Sarah had pointed out one thing that I think is important to touch on. You know, the legislature working with the governor, you know, $50 million went towards weatherization style programs. And so we do have a number of uses that are road tested and kind of have been evaluated, and many of those are being implemented already. Some of the structures of particular programs have to be worked out and adjusted. But I think we were successful in launching multiple programs. So that's actually one thing I would point the council towards is you know, we always want to know what we've already started doing, because some of those programs are probably going to be programs worth continuing, and there are already structures that have been vetted and approved. So I think we'll add to our book of work with state fiscal recovery every year. The thing I didn't touch on was the timeline. Probably a lot of you may be aware of it, but we have to obligate these funds, and obligate means commit it to a certain purpose through grant or contract by December 31st of 2024. So we have 3 years basically to decide and implement what we do with the funds. And then we have until 12/31/2026 to actually have all of the money spent. And what that means is some of the longer term structures, some of the longer term concepts don't work as well with state fiscal recovery funds. So at the federal level, these were passed and implemented, really intended to be, well, at least on the federal scale, short-term funds, short-term programs. So ideas that are more self-sustaining or longer term, they aren't going to always mesh very well with the state fiscal recovery funds. So that is one thing to keep in mind about these as a funding source.
Great. Super. Well, thanks again, Doug. Fantastic. And speaking of continuing on or knowing what's going on in the other areas, we have teed up Julie, as I mentioned, Julie, June, and Jen Holler to talk about water, broadband, and housing. And I think Julie and her, Secretary Moore in her presentation will talk a little bit about the use of the 50 million of climate specific things that have already happened, weatherization, other stuff. So why don't we do that? And let's do them. I wonder if we should do them all together and then take questions on the back end. Let's see, just to manage time a little bit. So why don't we get those 3 presentations and just write down your questions for yourself or throw them in the chat or something. And we'll just walk through those 3 presentations and then have a conversation on the back end. So Secretary Moore, let me turn it over to you for the first one. Hang on one second, you're still on mute.
I will plan to drive unless Jane tells me it's better for her to do it. Okay. So hopefully folks can now see my screen. I'm going to repeat a little bit of Doug said just to make sure we have all the same framing context. But we'll jump into the climate action and then more detail in the water infrastructure space, because there's a number of these initiatives that tack and tie to the climate plan. And I think it's important just to have an awareness of them. So overall, as Doug noted, we're looking at deploying approximately $1 billion between now and the end of calendar year 2024. And there was this broad agreement reached between the governor and the legislature last session on these 5 areas of investment: broadband, clean water, climate action, housing, and economic development. And you're going to hear presentations related to climate action, barely, clean water, housing, and broadband, just so folks have a complete set of information. Let's see here. So in terms of what had been funded for climate action in FY22, the governor had recommended expending about $25.5 million worth of ARPA funds in this space. And the agency that's in parentheses after each one of those investment numbers is the lead agency. And then the legislature actually settled on a somewhat different set of appropriations totaling $55 million. After the session ended, however, this $10 million for land conservation that was funded through VHCB ended up being swapped for general fund monies. So at this point, there's only $45 million of ARPA appropriations that have been expended in this space. The governor had indicated in his initial statement of intent for up to $200 million to be used to fund climate action initiatives. The legislature had indicated 250, but so in both instances, we're in this space of $175 to $200 million that's been at least earmarked to support climate action initiatives. I'll shift gears now and talk a little bit about water infrastructure initiatives. There was a total of $50 million appropriated for that use in FY22. 6 initiatives I'm going to describe briefly. Similar to the VHCB conservation dollars, there also had been money for dam safety improvements that ended up being funded using general fund. In addition, further monies were provided to DEC and to ANR for use by the Clean Water Board, but also for out year budgets. $50 million has been set aside at this point to support the continuation of the work I'm about to describe in FY23 and FY24. The first of the major initiatives is the Village Water and Sewer. And this makes grants to village centers and designated downtowns that currently lack community scale water or wastewater infrastructure. The grants are being scaled to ensure rates stay below a value per user per year, recognizing affordability has often been a challenge to these systems. Our recommended number had been $1,000 per user or per connection per year, but that is an area of active discussion with some of the grant applicants. We have $8 million available for this work in FY22 and are anticipating a total of $30 million to be invested in this space through the end of 24. And I just flagged that I think that this initiative aligns very well with this cross-cutting pathway number 1, which is looking at what's needed to support compact development. Next on the list is a sewer overflow initiative. So this is really focused on those communities with combined sewer systems and who have established a long-term compliance schedule with the agency. The first $10 million of this work funding for the first $10 million of this work's already gone out the door with grants to Montpelier, Northfield, Virgins, and St. Johnsbury. We're anticipating a total of $30 million worth of grants to be made in this space. And I think this aligns with the pathway for strategy 1 in the community resilience section of the climate action plan, where it saw increased investment in stormwater and green infrastructure, including the separating of combined sewer systems. Next on the list is the Stormwater Initiative. The bulk of this effort is focused on what we refer to at ANR as 3-acre properties or 3-acre sites. These are sites with more than 3 acres of impervious surface that were historically not subject to stormwater regulations, but brought into the fold as part of changes to the pollution budget we've developed for Lake Champlain. There's about 700 of these sites throughout the Champlain and Memphremagog basins. And the money in this instance is being used to hire engineering contractors to support those property owners in the assessment, design, and permitting needed to comply with the rules. There's also money in this particular bucket for VTrans to support some road-related stormwater investments. And then we had a number of projects that we'd been pushing through to design using Clean Water Fund dollars. And this will support the construction of these public-private partnership projects. There's $10 million available to support this work in FY22, and we're anticipating a total investment in stormwater management of $75 million. And again, believe this lines up with pathway 4 strategy 1 of the community resilience objectives. The other 2 water-related ARPA funded investments didn't have quite such a strong connection to things that were in the cap, but have flagged what I think they tack and tie to most closely. There were words in the cap around looking at pollution prevention programs at wastewater facilities, and pre-treatment may be another means to get at that end, where municipal facilities are being challenged to manage some of the high strength wastewaters that are sent to them by different commercial or industrial businesses. And then the Healthy Homes Initiative, which is really focused on making grants to both mobile home communities and income qualifying Vermonters to fix either failing or already failed drinking water and wastewater systems. And have flagged here, I think, again, there are connections to some of the different community resilience strategies. So I will stop there and hand it over to, I don't know if June or Jen is going next, but just to give a quick sense of what additional investments are part of the mix in terms of ARPA.
I would say let's have Jen go next, because what she's doing is more immediately related to what you've been talking about, Julie, and then I'll wrap up with broadband. You there, Jen? There she is. Okay.
Greetings, everyone. I tend to rely on slides, so can I fly through a few for everybody? Okay.
We should just, I think everybody knows you, Jen, but in case they don't,
Okay.
folks, we're gracious enough to be joined by Jen Holland, Director of Policy and Special Projects for Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And I'm looking forward to hearing her talk. So thanks so much, Jen, for making time to be here.
Okay, great. And let's see, do you see slide up on the screen now?
It hasn't quite gone to full screen yet, but we see your slides.
See how that looks. Is that it?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Jane. And we're Jane and I are leapfrogging each other a little bit today. She and David Farnsworth appeared before the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board to give us an update on the climate action plan, because there is so much of the work that VHCB does that is interrelated to the recommendations of the plan. So for those of you that may not be familiar with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, we're a quasi-governmental entity. We sit just outside of state government, established by the legislature for the dual purposes of creating affordable housing and conserving and protecting Vermont's ag, forest land, historic properties, and important natural areas. And we've been doing that for about 30 years. We administer state and federal funds. We do a lot of work around affordable housing, and much of that work has the same kind of values and imperatives that are embedded in the council's plan. The housing developments that the state funds through VHCB help mitigate and prepare for climate change in 4 essential ways. We require a high level of energy efficiency in the buildings we fund for a long period of time. The energy standard to which we apply to our housing developments has been above state code. We also encourage renewables whenever those are possible, done a lot with modern wood heat in buildings and solar. Historic preservation is a big part of our mission, and so wherever possible, we try to create or encourage housing in restored historic properties rather than creating new. We've been doing smart growth actually since before it was a term. Protecting the state's historic and compact settlement patterns was embedded in our statute in the late 80s. So that's something we think about a lot. What you see here is a building in Milton. It was one of the first near passive house standard buildings in the state. It's an affordable housing project for seniors. So energy efficiency in affordable housing can look exhibits in a lot of different ways. Here are 4 different kinds of examples of how that is manifested through what the state does through VHCB. So specifically to get to the ARPA, state fiscal recovery funds for housing development. So there are a number of housing agencies in Vermont, as you probably know, but the state directs its development funding or funding for bricks and mortars or capital funding through the Housing and Conservation Board. And in the last legislative session, the governor and the legislature agreed to direct a portion of the ARPA funding that they appropriated that session specifically for housing development in recognition of the housing crunch and the impact that COVID had on more vulnerable households. So 64 million was directed through VHCB, and the appropriating language specifically says that this is for the development of housing and shelter capacity with priority on those displaced from motels, including mixed income permanent housing and in consultation with the Agency of Human Services. So VHCB is working on a biweekly basis with Commissioner Brown's department, DCF, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Vermont State Housing Authority, and the Vermont Housing Finance Agency as we work strategically together to braid various different resources and target the ARPA SFR funding to where it can make the biggest impact. And I guess the point I really want to make here is that there are so many housing needs. ARPA SFR, for many of the reasons that you just heard Doug Farnham describe, for now has been targeted by the legislature, most specifically to serving those who are experiencing homelessness. There's another $5 million of ARPA SFR funds that is going through Josh Hanford's department within the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Chris Cochran's shop. And that is specifically for what is known as the VHIP program, which provides, I think at this point, it's $30,000 grants to private landlords to bring vacant or blighted units back up to code and back online, and to offer those who are coming out of homelessness. So the ARPA funds are on their way to being committed. I'll get to the numbers in a second, but to the left here, some of you may have driven by this. It's the site of the Twin City Motel, which is on the Barry Montpelier Road in Montpelier. That motel was acquired. It's under construction. Pieces of it are maintained, pieces of it are historic, and some of it's under construction to create new housing for the homeless. So that's underway now. So here's where we are with the ARPA funding that's coming through the HCB. Again, we are appropriated $64 million. $25.4 million of that has been committed to projects. We have in hand now another $24.5 million in applications, and we're reviewing those, and we'll make recommendations about those to the VHCB board at the end of January. So far, that funding, combined with some other state and federal funds, will eventually create 476 homes and beds, 375 rental units, and 205 of those are targeted and dedicated to those experiencing homelessness. There are 50 transitional units or shelter beds coming online. One of those is the picture I just showed you. Also, we've committed funding to 51 home ownership units statewide. And then another piece of what we do is fund home accessibility projects, help people stay in their homes with accessibility improvements like ramps and bathroom modifications. So that's the status. So a couple big picture items or observations I'd like to offer just to put this in context. And that is, and this will be no surprise to any of you, the current real estate market is putting enormous pressure on home prices and construction costs. So to the left is the chart that was put together by VHFA based on property transfer tax records. And you can see the difference in the median home sale prices from 2019 to 2021, with the yellow being just 2 years ago and the blue being more currently. I think a lot of us have heard that there's a lot of housing or price pressure, especially in resort towns, but it's really all across the state. And if you look at the first example, Ferrisburg, I think if you look 2 years ago, the median home price was about $190,000. That's within reach of a lot of Vermonters, but it's nearly doubled since then, putting it out of the reach of even moderately or middle income households. So that just gives you a snapshot of the kind of housing pressure that's going on. The most recent statewide housing needs assessment determined that Vermont needed an additional 5,000 homes. That was done before the pandemic and is really over the next 5 to 10 years. But Vermont's not alone in this. It's enormous numbers nationally. Housing development just has not kept pace with housing need over the last couple decades. And so that's why we're in the crunch that we're in right now, and exacerbated by the pandemic. So what's happening is disadvantaged and lower income households are being pushed out of the market more and more. Homelessness has more than doubled since before the pandemic. The Department of Children and Families, local service providers have done incredible work, and we've been able to bring more housing units online, and more than 1,300 households over the last year have been helped into permanent housing, but others have fallen into homelessness, and there are folks who have rental assistance, a voucher that will pay for the difference between what they make or income they have and rent, but they just simply cannot find an apartment. So a couple thoughts just for the council's consideration is that, and I know this is something you have all discussed, but when the topic is housing, it really bears repeating, is that how and where we build housing directly impacts the extent to which we mitigate emissions, whether it's how much and what kind of energy that home uses, to how far people drive to and from where they live. And then also in improving resilience, where is it in relationship to areas that may be flooded? Over time, the energy efficiency incentives available for housing development and and rehab have not kept pace with construction costs, and unfortunately, they've become less meaningful over time. We've engaged in an analysis here recently that compared what the level of energy efficiency that was included in buildings in the around mid-century or pre-1970 compared to what is done now, according to the building standards that we adhere to. And it's roughly about $40,000 a unit that is directly attributable to the energy costs. And the incentives for in many instances are more in the range of $2,700. So it's just gotten out of scale. Again, something else I know you're aware of, but is so important and we see it all the time now, that Vermont's likely to face increasing development pressure as the housing crisis continues, and households are migrating to the state. We see it on the conservation side of our work too, in terms of what land prices are looking like right now. And then finally, I'll just say, as we move together towards more efficient and eventually net zero homes, we need to, at the same time, ensure that we need to ensure that everyone has even just access to a home. So for another day, maybe, VHCB's conservation work and our farm and forest viability programs are also consistent with and support many of the CAP's recommendations, and we'd be happy to provide more information about that. And while there, I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. That's fantastic. June, do you want to finish up this round of presentations?
Yeah, I'll do a lightning round, and I'll start with a prayer that my screen sharing is going to work. This looks like the one I want. Share. Can you folks see my slides?
They're not in full screen yet, but they're there.
Okay, well, I'm not going to tempt fate by trying to find full screen. I'm just going to roll with this if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, you'll notice just is not my forte, and I do apologize for that. So from my point of view, broadband is the sleeper issue in climate change policy, because in so many ways, I think it undergirds much of what we want to do. I have at different times tried to raise this issue in our deliberations. And I think we're now coming to a place where, as we start to look at things more granularly, you're going to come to see why I see this nexus so clearly. And if you don't already, which I'm sure you do. And also this explains why my tenure as commissioner has been so broadband focused, because there's a lot of energy, a lot of momentum on the issues that you folks deal with, but we haven't made all the progress we need to in the state in tying our energy policy and our climate change and our resiliency policy to connectivity. I think these things are converging, and here's your proof. So last year in the legislative session, the legislature passed Act 71, and the governor supported it as well. This is designed to accelerate broadband expansion in the state. We have right now about 52,000 and change addresses in the state that, under federal law at least, do not qualify as high-speed broadband, which roughly speaking is a 25.3 Mbps speed. We have a state goal, not a requirement, but a goal that we aspire to 100 up, 100 down fiber for everybody in the state. And that's a pretty costly endeavor. That's been estimated to be anywhere from $350 to $1 billion worth of change to get that done in the state. We have a sizable presence of cable in the state that provides 25.3, and to hear Comcast and others tell it, they are capable of upgrading their technology to make speeds better. But for now, the focus of the state has been on getting those who have little or no connectivity connected to the internet. And that is what, for now, Act 71 is focused on. To this end, the legislature created the Vermont Community Broadband Board, much of which is modeled on the Clean Energy Development Board. Like CDEF, the Vermont Community Broadband Board is embedded in the state, in the Department of Public Service, and I provide administrative support for these folks. I try to help them through the Byzantine corridors of state government and the legislature and beyond. And otherwise, they function independently. They have an executive director, well known to all of us, Christine Hallquist, and they have a stellar board made up of alumni from a variety of Vermont utilities and the telecom industry itself. And I have great confidence in this board to achieve the mission of getting those 52,000 plus folks connected. And the way the Vermont Community Broadband Board is expected to do that is to use the network of communications union districts that Vermont has stood up over the last several years. I'll be showing you a map shortly of the territories of those communication union districts, and you'll see that they are throughout the state, and every one of them has a share of those 52,000 addresses that have no hope of getting broadband unless the Vermont Community Broadband Board's work is successful. So they are meeting as we speak, and they are trying to make the best decisions that they can using statutory criteria in Act 71 to deploy the first slug of ARPA money that was appropriated for this purpose last year, which was 150 million. I administer that technically, but I basically pass it through to the board. They have to date appropriated around 30 million of it in order to prepare the CUDs, the communications union districts, through planning work and acquiring pole attachment licenses, setting up infrastructure for their organizations to work, doing engineering studies, and so on and so forth. I won't bore you with all those details, except to say that Vermont was terribly fortunate that the ARPA money came at a time when Vermont had really just finished a very critical amount of planning in the connectivity space to have all these CUDs launched. I should probably backtrack and explain that when you hear me say CUD, you should think a fire district or a water district in your community. That's what these folks are. They are a district that has come together for the purpose of ensuring that every member in the community has access to broadband connectivity, excuse me. Here briefly, just to run through, these are the values that are being used to assess the work of the Vermont Community Broadband Board. The governor is intent on these values translating to all areas where ARPA money is being administered, whether it's in connectivity or in Julie's shop or others. And the Vermont Community Broadband Board, in turn, is working with these values in mind as well. It was very interesting to see how the governor's priorities at the end of the day aligned fully with the priorities that the board set for itself. So the order of business is to be fully transparent in how decisions are made to get connectivity and how the ARPA money is used to reach these 52,630 folks, give or take. We want tangible outcomes. We don't just want a bunch of plans that are sitting on a shelf somewhere. There should be real infrastructure deployed as a result of this money being spent. It needs to be transformative, and I think it's fair to say that if we can get every single Vermonter connected to the internet, we will have achieved universal access to broadband, which will be a first in this country, and I think it is well within our grasp. And then finally, the work needs to be completed in a timely manner, and there need to be verifiable results that comport with the obligations that were undertaken when the money was accepted by the CUD from the Vermont Community Broadband Board. And there's a mechanism for recoupment, and I won't bore you with the details of why that's important, except to say that that goes to the heart of accountability in the use of this money. Here is the map that I promised you. As you can see with the different colors, just about every part of Vermont is now in a communications union district, and the work is underway. One thing that I pushed very hard for, and I had many allies who helped make this happen, which I'm deeply grateful for, is that Act 71 and the use of that ARPA money can be used in a partnership between a communications union district and the existing internet service providers or electric utilities. And to my mind, that is the beachhead, if you will, of this convergence policy that I've been pursuing in my time here. If you have further details that you'd like to have about what I've just shared with you, I urge you to reach out to Rob Fish, who formerly was on my staff. By virtue of Act 71, was transferred to the Vermont Community Broadband Board. Rob is a very affable man, very energetic man, and very knowledgeable about this area, and can fill you in on the details of what the VCBB is doing. David, that's all I've got. And I'm going to try to stop sharing now.
Thanks. Mary.
Did I succeed? Ah,
You
very
did.
good.
Well
Okay.
done. Okay. Fantastic. All right. So those are initiatives that are very relevant for the work of your CAP. And yet from an accounting standpoint, they're not part of that 200 million of quote unquote climate action. Right? I just want to be super clear about that. Though that's what we just heard about, are things that are relevant for our plan, right? Aligned with the plan. And they're outside from an accounting place of the 200 million that's called climate action. All right, so let's not get tripped up in terminology and stuff like that. All right, so we could spend a lot of time asking questions about that. I think we may even try to avoid that because I want to create some time for you all as a council to talk about where you want to be setting your recommendations. And so with your permission, I'm going to just keep moving forward. And the next place, as you can see coming on the screen, is Jane. Go ahead, Jane. That's fine. Is to tee us up to actually have the conversation now about for that $200 million bucket, or some version of $200 million. Where do we want to go? So Jane's got something to tee us up to that conversation. I really think that that's some highest value use of our time today is to get there as a council. So Jane, why don't you take it away and tee us up to actually have the conversation?
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And thank you so much to June and Jen and Julie for your time and orientation, as well as Doug, of course. So I'm going to be brief. We've had some conversations about how this conversation could be teed up with all of you, recognizing $200 million is a lot of money. We are short on time and depth, perhaps, on what we can do as a council over the course of these next two meetings. And so I just want to frame up the possibilities and then turn it back over to all of you to have a conversation and consider what the process could look like. So, of course, just to recap, we have roughly $200 million to plan for. And then there are, of course, these investments that have already been made that overlap with the recommendations put forward in the Climate Action Plan. That gives us the chance to consider how we build upon those, complement those, are additive to those, but it's important perspective to understand where the funding is going right now in the state. The role of this council is really, it's your choice. The benefit of this conversation is to offer recommendations on what the priority action should be for this specific funding source. We need to decide as a council the level of detail and specificity that we want to put forward in that recommendation. And think of this really as a collaborative effort, both with the governor and the legislature. This is not a requirement of the GWSA. This is us acting in good faith to further prioritize the recommendations within our climate action plan that overlap and can hit the ground running, are project ready to be spent and put on the ground over the course of the next 3 years. Because as you heard, the funding must be obligated by the end of 2024, giving us 3 years. So the criteria is somewhat open-ended, but it must meet the federal guidelines for ARPA funds. And in particular, the two things that we're recognizing and appreciating have the clearest overlap are priority projects that serve low-income Vermonters, as well as have an infrastructure focus, something that's building and creating jobs. And these projects have to be ready or close to ready for implementation. As we already said, they must be obligated by the end of 2024. So today, the goal was really to learn about the conditions around this funding, understand what the type of recommendation from all of you that you want to seek to make. The idea would be that we could include dollar amounts and offer a list with or without relative priority and indicate an estimated cost of fully funding the action. So really for us, it's about setting parameters around if weatherization likely can't be overfunded, but if we wanted to put it towards the projects already on the ground with OEO in particular, there's probably a cap in which is reasonable to expect to be able to put on the ground over the course of the next 3 years. that kind of specificity around projects will be important as we're thinking about the total amount of funding we have to put forward. So today we can start to consider what those priority projects might look like, think about initial ideas, hear from some of the secretaries and commissioners around where these investments would have the largest impact on programs already being lifted up. But then hopefully over the course of the next 2 weeks between this meeting and the meeting on the 21st, work through the subcommittees to put forward the specific priorities that they see with respect to resilience and adaptation and emissions reductions projects, and think about how much we want to put towards each one of those climate action buckets. The meeting on the 21st, if we choose to sort of really dive into this, will be focused on reaching consensus around what those recommendations are. And then ultimately, I would imagine we would memorialize those recommendations as list of priorities, buckets of work in a memo put forward to the governor and the legislature from the council. That is pretty much the amount of specificity that we really have right now, and really want to sort of hear from all of you about the next steps and how committed we are to working through this process, recognizing this is a big thing to take on top of just having adopted the climate action plan last week.
Super. Thanks, Jane. Okay. So that's where we're at. It feels like we've got a two-step thing to do right now. On the one hand, we need to talk a little bit about the shape of the recommendation that we're aiming to make, set some expectation for ourselves of what we're trying to do. On the other hand, we've seen it happen in the chat and in the conversation. We can start right now laying out things that jump out at us as being particularly relevant of meeting these criteria we've been talking about today. So we can even just start shouting these things out now. But I don't want to get too far down the road of shouting it out before we actually reach a little bit of tentative agreement, at least on what do we think we actually are putting in our memo? What's the type, the sort of shape of the recommendation, the level of specificity? I think it's good that we have that conversation so subcommittees don't go off on wildly different routes in how they're doing this. Rich, go ahead, please.
Well, I agree with everything you just said. I expect that cross-sector will want to deliberate on this, and so I don't want to jump ahead of the committee. But I would suggest that among the criteria that we consider would be the following three, and we can probably add some more. That is, one would be impact. That is, how can we spend this money to have the greatest impact towards the goals set in the GWSA, including mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience. Second, a focus on equity. And we've, in many instances, made the point that we want the climate plan to be implemented in such a way that from the very beginning, it is as equitable as possible. And third would be leverage, recognizing that these funds are funds that need to be spent relatively soon. Can we envision spending them in a way that they create an on-ramp to programs that will deliver much greater savings over a longer period of time? So instead of asking, how can we just have a quick hit, ask ourselves, how can we use this money to invest in building those on-ramps, because we know so much of our work is going to be going on for decades and longer. Those are three criteria I would put on my list of asks for the committees to think through.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, June?
I wonder if maybe you want to go to Jared or Chris or others, because mine's more of a process question and it probably sounds a sour note. So I would rather speak later.
Okay, I'll hit the pause button on that for a second. I'll go to Sue first, and then Jared, and June, jump in when you're ready. Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, mine is maybe a good follow-on to, I guess, Rich's proposal around equity, and that's to actually set a criteria, a threshold investment level. And I'm putting this forward as something that is being done in the New York State Climate Action Plan. They actually have a minimum of 35% of all investments go toward disadvantaged communities. Another approach has been put forward by the Biden administration under something called Justice 40. That is sort of a promise to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits, I think measuring impact from federal investments into climate and energy for disadvantaged communities. So, you know, following on what we started our meeting with today, and one of the 3 criteria set forth by Rich Cowart is equity. We could actually define that by setting a clear threshold, a minimum threshold of investment. So that would be a way of thinking that I would like to put on the table.
Great, thanks. Jared?
Thanks. Yeah, I, similar to Rich, wrote down some of the criteria that I think that I want to surface, and perhaps not surprisingly, 2 of the 3 criteria that I wrote align exactly with what Rich said, specifically, you know, cost-effective emissions reduction as a key criteria, and equitable, economically beneficial investments as well. The other one that's, and I agree with what Rich said around leverage and everything that Sue just said. I think another criteria that I don't think has been mentioned that I want to put forward is investments and strategies that help us overcome gaps or barriers that can unlock the possibility of further pollution reduction and cost savings longer term. So there's a couple of key things. I'm just thinking on like the emissions reduction side and the cost saving side in terms of energy right now. You know, when we weatherize homes, especially low and moderate income homes, the benefit there is not, of course, just the direct emissions reduction, but oftentimes, you know, a home that's more efficient can then is more able to switch to cleaner, more efficient heating sources with options that they may not have had if the home was not weatherized. You know, I think another kind of threshold level thing that can unlock a lot more adoption for cost savings and for pollution reduction is the expansion of electric vehicle supply equipment or EV charging infrastructure, especially in multi-unit dwellings where, you know, people aren't in single family homes, so can't just charge in their garage, and in more rural areas to address issues around range anxiety. And so in thinking through each of those criteria, my mind then goes to what are the resources we have at hand to help assess some of those things. And in terms of the cost effectiveness question, I think that there's 2 things that come to mind. One, I think we need to remind ourselves that there's been some really important cost effectiveness work that the Public Service Department has done, looking at the kind of highest savings per ton avoided or lowest cost per ton avoided of greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the things that scored really highly there in creating savings. So it was a net negative cost in economics speak, in regular people speak, it was you were getting pollution reductions while saving money. Were the things that were at the top of the list were incentives for EVs, for heat pump water heaters, and for weatherization. So I think we really need to focus on those. The other question I have is with regard to, and I think I'm going to look to Jane on this one. My recollection is that when we signed the contract with Cadmus and EFG, one of the deliverables was what we called in technical speak a mitigation supply curve, but it was basically building upon and expanding the Public Service Department analysis on cost effectiveness to a broader set of actions and possible strategies to more holistically assess cost effectiveness. And I'm wondering if we have an update on kind of where that stands and if that will be an available resource for these deliberations. And then the last thing I would just say is, while I agree with everything that Sue said, I do think we want to be careful about the definitions and criteria around, you know, disadvantaged communities. And what I'm specifically thinking about here is EAN has done some research about where EV incentives are going using data from DMV and Drive Electric. And one of the things that we see within that data, there's evidence of, is that there are upper income people in what are lower income communities taking advantage of incentives. And there may be lower income folks in higher income communities that are not. And so I want to make sure that we don't just kind of set certain zip codes up for eligibility without recognizing that in terms of economic equity, there are lower income folks in communities that have higher median household income, and that there are, and the reverse is also true. So I'm hoping that can be a nuanced, careful assessment of equity that is not just on a geographic basis, but that is really looking at things like household income and wealth.
Right. I'm just going to flag for folks that when we talk about the deliberation here, while the subcommittees will have time, you all as a council have precious little time on this one, given the funding cycle. And so that was one of the reasons I asked for thinking through what this recommendation looks like. Thinking through, are you looking for dollar amounts? Are you looking to set a sort of, here's the top 10 ideas? Like, I want to prompt that thinking in you so that the expectation is clear of what we can achieve 2 weeks from now in developing this memo. Chris?
Yeah, so from my perspective, this is probably the only chance in this generation and some generations to come to actually get the investment needed to invest in water and wastewater infrastructure, especially in villages, and also expanding capacity in downtowns where capacity is limited, but especially rural villages, which is also translates directly to the only chance to establish the infrastructure to actually retain existing homes and businesses in villages, the ability for businesses that already exist to expand in villages, but most importantly, the opportunity to really actually create rural housing, workforce housing at any kind of meaningful scale. Because in the absence of water and wastewater, you're not going to have that ever. You don't just magically build, 20, 30 units. You don't build daycare centers. You don't build adult daycare centers. You don't build assisted care centers. You don't build transitional housing for people as they get older without those water and wastewater systems. They just don't happen. Around the rest of the country, they do a really good job of building infrastructure and then chasing the infrastructure with planning. In New England, we seem to do the opposite. We do the policy work, but then we don't invest in the infrastructure. I developed a panel at this latest meeting of the Northern New England Chapter of the American Planning Association, and the conversation was, the original title for the forum was Talking Shit, the Fallacy of Compact Settlement in the Absence of Infrastructure. I dropped the first part of that for the title of the actual title of the session, but when it got to having a discussion about, there were about 40 planners in the room from all over New England, and we started having conversations about successful efforts to implement water and wastewater systems. Nobody raised their hands because we're just not real good at it. In part, I think, because we rely too much on federal money. But now we have an opportunity, and one of the things we need to recognize is a lot of this ARPA money is totally under the control of municipalities, and how that's ultimately going to get leveraged. So I'm just throwing this out there before we think too broad. We need to think about ultimately how Vermont develops for this current generation of Vermonters and future generations of Vermonters, and what the future land use settlement pattern is going to be. Because if we don't do this now, what you're going to wind up with is large lot development on Class 3 town roads, and that's going to compromise energy conservation efforts, climate resilience and adaptation efforts, land conservation efforts, trying to reduce forest fragmentation, trying to improve water quality, everything. Because I suspect once people really wake up to Vermont, we start seeing more people move here. I don't think Vermont has really seen development the way it's going to eventually see it. And we better have accommodation to where it's going to go. So just throwing that out there, there are multiple benefits to investing in that infrastructure. And this is probably the only chance it's going to happen.
Thanks, Chris. Joey?
Thanks. Yeah, appreciating a lot of the comments. One of my questions I have, and maybe this is a Doug question, is what sort of flexibility there could be to invest in, like, the partners or the systems. How can we potentially direct our recommendations to fund like VHCB and some of their housing and conservation programs, or the Clean Energy Development Fund? How much can we provide guidance to some of the trusted partners that are already doing this work, and have some sort of placeholder to trust in that they, with some parameters that we would offer or recommend around it, and enable them to do this work. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, could there, whether it's at CDF or some other place, like, could there be like an emergency fund, and we create a way for people to identify where they might have a need coming up, like an old car or a 40-year-old boiler like we just had in my house, so that when they're in a predicament and they're going to have to make a major investment, that we can potentially help them avail themselves of an option that we would help subsidize, especially for lower income Vermonters. So I just wonder what kind of flexibility there may be in, and I just want to underscore, I think just investing in and potentially partnering with and leaning into the systems and the programs and the partners that are doing this work would be critical. And I also want to support the concept that Sue is putting on the table, some sort of minimum level of investment. So anyway, just some questions that I'd love to consider further.
Thanks, Joey. June, and then Julie.
That's a good springing point from where Joey was a moment ago. I won't speak to the flexibility thing directly, Joey, except to say that I think the council can make its recommendations, right, in the memo. And you have to remember that these recommendations are going, if I'm not mistaken, to the legislature I think that's the case for more specific appropriation, and possibly to the governor. Forgive my woolliness here, but this is the point I wanted to make earlier, David, that may be slightly sour. And that is that I'm experiencing a fair amount of discomfort at this juncture, because on one hand, I'm on this council, and these are the council's deliberations about what to do with this $200 million that's been earmarked for its thinking. And on the other hand, I'm in the governor's cabinet, and the governor is preparing his budget and his views about how to use ARPA money going forward. So it's a strange tension that I'm experiencing. And so you may find that I'm even more quiet than usual as we sketch out our plan going forward here. But it seems to me that if it's the collective wisdom, if I'm not transgressing here, that the thing to do is to commit some of this money to trusted partners. I have to think that there are efficiencies to be gained from doing that, because then you're not standing up new programs and so on, so on, so on. But I mean, the hallmark here, the bellwether here is who has control over those funding decisions. And I think as long as we stay clear on the fact that at the end, I think it's the legislature. I'm just not sure. I think we're good to go. Thank you.
Thanks, June. Julie?
Maybe building a little bit off what June was saying there. I mean, I think, there ultimately what the council is being asked to produce is a set of recommendations that will be transmitted to the governor and the legislature as a memo. And I just would urge some caution about getting too deep under the hood. I think trying to give high level framing and criteria or specific initiatives and asking that they be funded at scale may produce a better result than trying to actually dictate exactly how the money is distributed, or at least not complicate it. And my concern would be that if we get too specific in our recommendations and for some reason they do fall apart, I think it runs the risk of undermining the entire initiative, and just encourage folks to stay high level and maybe give some guiding principles, either the ones developed by the Just Transition Subcommittee or others that really should guide how those investments are made.
Okay. All right. So we've talked a little bit about criteria. We've talked a little bit about some initial ideas. And now we're getting to the place of like, what does this actually look like when we're done 2 weeks from now, right? Is it more like a high level document with some orientation about areas? What is this? And so I think what I'd like to do is just say, you know, could someone help build off what Julie just said about the shape of this thing and what we should collectively aim for 2 weeks from now? Like, what should this memo look like? Is it a list of 10 big ideas that we think should be the focus areas? Does it include some dollar numbers? Does it do something else? And I'd be interested in your reflections about what you think that memo really looks like 2 weeks from now. Any thoughts? Because this relates to the instruction that the subcommittees need to go do the work.
David, until somebody else speaks up, I'm just going to say it would help me enormously to know who the memo is addressed to. If it's who I think it is, which, as Julia said, would be the governor and the legislature, I think Rich had a very nice collection of principles, and also the idea of prioritizing where we direct the dollars first. And so, you know, what Julie was saying a moment ago is we need to provide guidance, and it would be best to provide guidance that can be used by the recipients who will be thinking about how to use these dollars, as opposed to trying to direct every last cent and precisely to whom. That would be my view. So it should be a memo that collects some principles, that expresses priorities, and that is philosophical more than instructive. I didn't say it the right way, but I think you guys understand what I mean.
Great. Thanks. Chris?
We need to take into account the needs and experience of the whole state with regard to this. We're kind of heavy on the Montpelier, Shelburne, Burlington, St. Albans corridor. And we need to think about what are the needs statewide from many different perspectives. But I just want to make sure that, even the lived experience is not overly focused on where a lot of the members of the panel are hailing from.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the instruction for the subcommittees over the next 10 days or so is to try to think about these principles we've talked about today, these criteria, we're calling criteria principles, which, by the way, mirror the principles and criteria that we used previously and over the last 3 months, with some new additions, right? We've added on to it this idea of leverage, this idea of unlocking future action through this sort of launching off place. And in the equity space, we're trying to be even more explicit about potentially being thoughtful about understanding what percentage of the funding would go in to specific marginalized communities, our communities in need. Okay. All right. And the memo should talk about ideas, right? Therefore, we think weatherization, we think this kind of resilience work, we think this kind of stuff works. Okay. For those of you who are going to be participating in these subcommittee meetings, are there other questions you have about what specifically we're asking folks to do as we do this work? Rich?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that I think it would be unproductive for us to try to allocate the funds as though we were ourselves cutting the pie. I think that I'm going to echo what June just said and what I think Julie said as well, that we are far better off with a policy statement and a set of criteria. And by the way, one of the criteria which is implicit, we didn't say it yet, is, by the way, we urge you in allocating these funds to look at what is recommended already in the climate action plan. We already have a lot of recommendations, including those regarding resilience, adaptation, smart growth, and mitigation. So we don't have to solve all these problems. We have a set of criteria which you just reiterated, David, which I think is pretty good.
Okay, great. Erica?
I think I'm going to echo what Rich said. I think what I'm hearing and what I'm taking away is that we are doing a bit more prioritizing of our actions that are already in the climate action plan, and maybe adding a little bit more detail, but not too much around, how in terms of recommendations back to the council on how to accomplish some of those through funding.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be really clear about the direction that I'm going to take, Catherine and I are going to take our subcommittee in.
Right. This is not an exercise. Sorry, my dog's making noise. This is not an exercise to invent new actions and ideas. You just spent a lot of hard-earned time doing that. Sorry, my dog's. Sorry, the arrival of the children is always excitement for the dog. All right. This is an exercise about taking a specific pot of money that these ARPA dollars and understanding how you would apply your thinking to this, right? So that's where these additional criteria such as leverage or, unlocking future things that are ready to go, right? Not to mention everything that fits into the ARPA criteria that the feds are saying. That's what the conversation is. And the output, it sounds like, is a set of ideas and principles, and then and this is what we think meets those principles at a kind of high level. I think that could be a really powerful outcome. Does that make sense? Or do folks want to suggest something else? Okay. And this absolutely is not emissions reductions only pot of money, right? This is, these are actions around resilience and adaptation that also fit those criteria of fitting the federal guidelines, being in that sort of ready to go space, potentially leveraging additional activity in the future, right? So everything's on the table in that sense, as long as it fits the federal guidelines on this. Abby?
I apologize. I missed some of the discussion. I had to go pick up my son, but I am getting the sense that, to your point, David, a lot of this, at least the discussion in this moment, is mitigation focused. And I guess for our subcommittee's purposes, I think we have struggled to know, or, we have spent a lot of time doing the things that we've been doing. And I just continuously get the feeling that that's just not where the will of the council is to do a lot of work. And I'm wondering how much time our subcommittee should really be spending thinking about this if the will of this council is not to really, go towards investing in that direction, which, at the end of the day has kind of been my takeaway from a lot of this. And I'm very cognizant of the amount of time that the subcommittee has already spent, and just thinking about what their time looks like upcoming, and how how we engage them in this way and how we assure them that, you know, their work is being weighed as prominently as everyone else's. And I think we've struggled some with that.
Yeah, I think the key here, Abby, is understanding when you and your fellow subcommittee members look at this ARPA funding opportunity and the criteria that it requires, are there logical fits where there's a really good case to be made that these are a set of ideas that meet this particular bucket of funding, right? And that are ready to be part of this story. And I think those are conversations that I think subcommittees are invited to have, and nobody is saying you got to have them, right? I think it's like you're invited to have this conversation, and we recognize everyone's feeling a little tired, right? Like when we put together this agenda, we forgot to put in a break, and we've been going for like 3.5 hours or something now. It's like we're kind of making mistakes a little bit because we're all a little bit tired. And so you're invited to have that conversation. And then on 2 weeks from now, when the council gets back together, put ideas on the table if you want to, right? And to say, we think this is a great fit for the ARPA funding for this reason. I think that's at least the way I see it, Abby. Jane?
Yeah, so I just want to sort of process what I'm hearing and respect and support that I do think the subcommittees, having worked with them closely, are going to need a little more guidance than what's sort of percolating right now at this meeting in order to make it be a fruitful conversation. And so I just want to suggest that around the criteria and the principles, I think that is something based on our conversation that we can flesh out as a way to start the conversation with subcommittees. But I think that next step of what we're asking them to do with further prioritization is where I'm still actually also getting a little hung up on what that next step is. So are we asking for it would be great just to like test out what those broad parameters are. Are they the actual buckets of work via the pathways, strategies, and or actions? And at what level do we ask folks to put forward their ideas? Like 3 top ideas, 3 to 5 top ideas from each subcommittee. Those kind of basic like components are actually, really needed in this process for subcommittees. So, and then how we actually do that in a strategic way when there is overlap in areas of expertise and work, like with rural resilience and ag and eco. If we're thinking about resilience and adaptation at this level and this scale, it might make sense to think about that together. And I know Erica is already suggesting that in others, and how we would do that productively on a short timeline would be challenging. So, and then again, that level of specificity, are we just talking about the components that we want to see investment made in? Or are we talking about at what level, via how much dollars to what? Because that is where things get perhaps more uncomfortable and more challenging on a short timeline.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Jane, for pushing us to be even more specific. Yeah. All right. So I'd welcome additional thoughts from folks about what it is you need to have a productive subcommittee conversation. I recognize we've been going for a few hours now without a break, and it's really hard to keep thinking on Zoom like this for many hours. And so that's a tough thing to do. I wonder if what we need to do here is we can summarize as far as we've gotten from this meeting in notes. We've had some fairly clear messages on some pieces of this, like let's not get too far into the weeds. Let's not assume we're going to be allocating specific dollar amounts here. Let's try to create a set of principles and then have some initial analysis that allows the legislature and the governor to see what that means in terms of the range of recommendations our climate action plan has and which are most applicable to these ARPA dollars. So I think it's possible for us to summarize that and push it back out to you all in the coming day or two. And that way subcommittees will have some greater clarity, written clarity, before convening a conversation about this. Are there any other things that folks want to say before we go into next steps and public comment and finish up today?
David, when are we going to talk about when our signing statements and dissents are due?
That's the next steps piece right
Okay.
now. Yeah, right now. Okay, all right. So let's do this, folks. Let's go into the next steps for us. Expect some written piece from us that will be a meeting summary, but also turned into something like an instruction statement for subcommittees as you go off and try to have this conversation in your subcommittees and think about what it is you want to elevate up into this memo. Jane, do you want to walk us through next steps?
Yes, happy to. Hold on. Okay, briefly, appreciating the time and wanting to leave a few minutes for the last thing on this slide specifically. So I just wanted to share with you all, my apologies for not having shared this via email, but because of the nature of the timeline being further out than we had originally discussed at the meeting, hopefully folks will forgive us, but we've been thinking about the dissenting opinions and the signing statements as part of the appendices. And because one significant component of the appendix is the technical analysis component of the work, the final Vermont Pathways report, that has a pretty structured timeline associated with how we're going to finish that piece of work. And it sets us up for finishing that specifically on the end of the week. I think it's Friday. Friday is December 17th, I believe. And we are proposing that based on the fact that we won't have that the Pathways analysis, that we'd like to ask folks to get us their dissenting opinions and signing statements by the 16th of December, which is a Thursday, which would then give Marion and I Friday to put together the full package of appendices to post with the agenda for the Climate Council meeting the following Tuesday, for you to essentially adopt the appendices, I should say, that will get added to the Climate Action Plan when we meet then on that Tuesday. So again, we don't need the signing statements this week. By next Thursday would be ideal. Anytime before that, happy to clean up and process into one document as soon as we have them. But again, these are your option to write. Nobody is required to write a signing statement or a dissenting opinion, obviously. And if you want any help remembering what the dissenting opinions were and who had commented on wanting to write one, we have that spreadsheet. I'd be happy to share that via an email with a meeting summary from today so that folks can see where they had expressed an interest of writing a dissenting opinion. I'll pause there before I move to the next piece of next steps to see if there were any questions on that specifically. The next thing here that I just wanted to highlight is the process reflection. We heard Leslie Ann and others of all of you really reflect on where we fell short, where we possibly did all right by all of you in putting forward this first climate action plan, but really want to learn and adapt based on what we got right and what we got wrong over the course of the last year, and where we can make improvements as we move forward. Marion has been working hard on standing up a survey that we'd like to put out to all of you this month and leave open for an extended period of time with the intent of summarizing what we hear from all of you and dedicating a larger component of, if not a whole meeting of the Climate Council in 2022 to reflect on the process over the last year and where we can make process improvements, both internally, organizationally, as well as outwardly through our public engagement. That survey we had hoped to say we would put live tomorrow, but one of the components of the contract that we had with Kaya to support the equity work of the council and its subcommittees was going to be not only one-on-one interviews with all of you where you wanted to participate with her, she was also going to stand up her own survey to hear from all of you about where the work fell short, with particular focus on the equity components of the work. And so we're meeting with Kaya at the end of this week to think about how we incorporate some of the questions she was going to ask into one larger process survey that we will put forward hopefully next week sometime, and then leave open into the new year for you all to work on and reflect. So I'll pause there, but want to let you know that we're thinking about that and are open to suggestions. Please feel free to reach out to Marian or I about any ideas that you have in that space. Chris, go ahead.
Jay and I and Catherine have both asked about having on a steering committee or council agenda. What does the council budget look like going forward? What are we prioritizing? What are we spending money on? Can we get that on the agenda soon?
Yeah, happy to. We recently provided an update on that to some members of the public, actually, who were asking detailed questions about the GWSA budget, and have a nice summary statement on it that could be what we use to tee up a conversation with all of you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So if there's no other questions, I'll just go right into the next one, which is really about wanting to turn to all of you about thinking about what the council meeting schedule looks like after the 21st of December. We don't have any other meetings scheduled right now. And so I expect that we would want to meet as a council in 2022 at the very least monthly, but wanted to hear from all of you if you're feeling like the need and work of the council requires more frequent meetings, perhaps bi-weekly. And then also hear from all of you about whether you'd like to keep Tuesday afternoons or if you'd like us to start with a new poll and start from scratch for 2022 to see what works for all of you, understanding that schedules change and this might not be the best time anymore. And then just wanted to also say that we don't have any steering committee meetings right now on the schedule, but we assume that the steering committee will also, in service to the work of the council, start to meet up again based on the schedule that we put forward for the whole council for 2022. I'll stop sharing and then see if people have comments or thoughts on how best to move that forward. I see Leslie Ann has her hand up, so I'll stop.
Jane, I was going to put my hand up for that one. So remembering that teaching schedules change every semester, I'm actually, yeah, I know you put that on there just for me. Yeah, so my teaching schedule is actually going to be Tuesday, Thursdays from like 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock. So I wouldn't be able to attend Tuesday afternoon meetings. So just wanted to put that out there.
Let's just say we'll do a poll then again.
All right. Fresh year, fresh poll. Let's see how we do. All right. Okay. And does anybody have a strong feeling on the frequency? Right. We're really balancing here, like giving ourselves a realistic amount of work while also making sure we have time to do the work. Erica and then June.
I'm just going to put the friendly reminder out there that subcommittee will probably have to also continue to meet as well. So just take that into consideration when we think about how often the council should be continuing to meet.
Right. And I think what's implicit in what you're saying, Erica, is like maybe once a month and then the subcommittees meet on the other 2-week segment kind of thing.
Let's try to keep it sane.
Yeah, I hear you. Yep. June?
Well, along those lines, let's talk about sanity, because I think I acclimated to the intense schedule that we had, and it was a completely unsustainable pace. And I'm mindful of the commitment I made to Abby that I would do what I could do in my power to make sure that the process going forward is more sustainable. So on one hand, we've gained a lot of momentum and we got an amazing piece of work done last week on Wednesday. And on the other hand, I won't speak for my colleagues in state government, but I will say for my agency, we cannot sustain this level of effort. So I think our expectations need to be recalibrated, especially given the approach of the legislative session. These blocks of 4-hour afternoon meetings, it just simply cannot be done. So if we can't make a bargain, in isolation, that we're just going to scale these meetings back for a while, and have the intervening periods lengthen, then we really need to be specific about what our next objective is and why it would require an effort that is on par with what we've been doing. Because at some point I answer to the public and to the many constituencies I have in the regulatory world who have not been getting their fair share of my attention.
Thanks, June. Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, we really, just to June's point, we really do need to look at this in aggregate, because I've already been asked to speak to different groups. I imagine the legislature is going to ask some of us, at least some subset of us, to testify. And so that's going to be happening. And, I am fortunate that my time is compensated, but like June, I've got 27 towns that I serve. They expect a lot of time from me and then my staff who've suffered during this chunk. It has been somewhat mentally healing to have the plan done, but yeah, this pace can't keep up. The downside is to my mind, there's still all the public outreach that needs to happen, with the release of the plan. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm hoping collectively we can figure this out, but it just feels to me like, as counselors, not as staff, not putting all this on, because we can't for a lot of reasons, but not putting this on consultants or staff. To my mind, at some level, we collectively, together need to get out into the public and talk about this work and talk about this plan. I don't know what that looks like, but it just feels like we need to be Vermonters talking to Vermonters about what's being proposed for the future of the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Bram, were you trying to say something?
Yes, I think you are not hearing a great deal of enthusiasm for meeting more than monthly. I think it also, with the amount of work we have to do, it feels like it would be difficult to maintain and make progress on everything we're trying to do with less than monthly. And if it's not less than one and it's not greater than one, then it's one, right?
Yeah, thanks, Bram. Well synthesized. All right, I think the message is pretty clear, folks, unless someone wants to push back on it with a different view. We appreciate that. Okay, unless there is anything else on this subject we want to do, let's do some public comment. But before I go to public comment, is there anything else, folks, on this? Great. Sorry about that, Annette. All right, Annette, yes. Or wait, hang on one second. Leslie Ann, sorry.
Yeah, so sorry about that. I did want to actually sort of flag that as we're thinking about all of this moving forward and thinking about hearing all voices, that if we do want meaningful input from folks who are joining us who are not council members, we may need to sort of think about the time or the day if we want to make sure that people at all life stages and all economic groups are able to participate as we would like them to. So just wanted to sort of flag that.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's do some public comment. Annette, I know you wanted to speak, so let me just go straight to you. And then others who would want to speak, please raise your hand in the Zoom function. This is also a great time to use the chat. If you're a member of the public, you want to put a comment in there, you're welcome to. But Annette, please go ahead.
Thank you. You covered a lot of ground. I have comments on a number of different things. First, on the public outreach that was done, I got some not very positive feedback by the about the contractors. They were from out of state. I think that it's very important that people understand Vermont, and I don't really think that was a successful effort, partly because it was outsourced. Last week, the Department of Public Service held hearings on the comprehensive energy plan, and not a whole lot of people participated, but I actually looked up everyone who did. I will admit I find it rather creepy, but I want to see who's there. And there were a lot of people from regional planning commissions, but mostly it was people monitoring. I think I identified maybe one person, maybe two people who were actual like Vermont citizens. But at least I had a demographic view of who was there. And I did share that with the department because I think it's important to understand and see who's showing up for these things and also who's speaking and who's not speaking. I looked at the document that Jared posted about deliberative polling, and I guess I would call it focus groups. And I think about, well, who really has the pulse on Vermont and who knows what's going on in our towns? And to a great extent, it's town clerks. They can tell you what's going on in the town. So I wonder about working with VLCT and putting together some focus groups, maybe regionally, because every region of this state is different. And to that point, I will note, as Abby pointed out, that there is not geographic diversity on this council. I mapped it all when you all were appointed. And with the exception of Chris and Abby, everyone else is pretty much the I-89 corridor between Burlington and Montpelier or a little beyond. But in addition to Bennington County, I don't think Rutland County has any. I mean, I could go get my map again, but I didn't do that. On the topic of housing, having been very close to homeless in my life and working with people in mobile home parks, and that's sort of the pits of my work when I have to try and get people housing. And so I feel very strongly about the use of this money towards getting people places to live. I mean, if there's any way to do that. I have two substantive comments that I'm going to put a link in for each one. The first one is about the suggestion that you ask the legislature to, or recommend to the legislature that they change the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I'd invite you to click on that link and look at that graphic. Because a lot of your discussions, and I think the frustrations that I'm hearing from especially the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, is that the work that they've been doing isn't really supported by the sole focus on reducing carbon emissions. And so I think that graphic is an excellent way of viewing the challenges that our planet faces, that so much of what we are dealing with is outside of carbon emissions. And if the Global Warming Solutions Act was expanded, I think that would give people a better and easier way to focus and feel that their work was valuable. The other link that I'm going to put in, and again, I'll ask you to look at it because people don't save the chat, is a study that talks about affluence. And while a lot of the work has been about just transitions and dealing with the lower income and people who are marginalized, this is a really good paper that talks about the role of the affluent and the tremendous amount of impact that the affluent have on overconsumption. And that's really not been a topic at all. And I highly recommend that that be brought into it, because I mean, I don't know how relevant it is to the ARPA funding, but there may be some relevance to it. And it's also relevant to what Chris Campany was saying about how we're going to end up as a gated community with McMansions if we're not careful. I mean, we're seeing it in southern Vermont. And finally, my understanding was that there was going to be some coordinated work between the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystem subcommittee. And if you are considering making changes to the subcommittee, that is where I would like to actually be a member, because my work transcends both of those. I've been monitoring both of those committees. It's very frustrating to see the lack of connection between the two. And so I'll just put that in as a suggestion, that there are a couple other people I'm aware of who've put the time in to really understand what this council is doing, and that there is good work that can be done that is meaningful, but that the discussions have been too siloed. So thank you very much for hearing me today.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you for being so involved in this process and paying so much attention. Okay, other members or other observers today, folks who've been watching the work of the council, would like to make a comment? Okay. Okay. All right. I'll apologize that we didn't schedule a break for in this meeting, and that's just on us, and my apology. That should never happen again. It was a bit of a marathon to do this without a break. We're done for today. As I mentioned, we will make some clear write-ups from this meeting and turn that into some clear instruction for subcommittees as you go forth and try to have this conversation about how you want to lift up certain things that are most relevant for the ARPA funding conversation. With that, unless anybody else has a parting comment, I think we can adjourn, but let me just pause. Leslie Ann, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I've been so chatty today. So I just wanted to lift up the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee, particularly around all of the guiding principles and the frontline communities. I actually shared a lot of those resources with the National Climate Assessment, the 5th National Climate Assessment. Very well received. It's going to be used in the water chapter and parts of that. It's also going to be used in Nevada as part of their planning process. So I just wanted to give kudos and a shout out to all of the really, really tremendous work that went into not just the subcommittee, but all of the peoples that whose voices were brought to bear in bringing those principles together. So kudos to all who were involved on that.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. That's a great way to end. Thanks. Wonderful. All right, folks. We'll see you in 2 weeks. You'll be hearing from us before then. And if you choose to convene your subcommittees to look at the conversation around ARPA funding, and you have any questions about that, obviously Jane and others are a great resource so that nobody's feeling like they're spinning the wheels in these conversations. All right, everybody, take care. Have a good afternoon. All the best.